Atito, welcome to the journey. My name's Leon Polam, the writer, researcher, and founder of Let's Drive an Indian Path, the YouTube channel. I also create GPS triggered audio tours of those same paths that you can drive the modern roads that were built on top of them while I tell stories about the people, the ancient people who walked them, as well as the settlers who followed them. In this post, we continue our journey along the Raystown Path, which is now the Pennsylvania Turnpike. We are at Hannistown. It was raided during the American Revolution, and quite a bit of violence went on there. But you likely didn't learn about it in school. I'll tell you why. Don't worry, I'll spare you the graphic details of the violence that went on. In this post, I also get into just who did all the mapping of these Native American trails. It wasn't me, I just do the driving. Won't you join me? It's a very interesting drive. This is Hannistown. It was 3 taverns, just like this one, and maybe 30 houses. It was inhabited by ordinary people. Ordinary for the time, ordinary for the frontier. There were men who people looked up to. They looked at them with respect and reverence. They were known as Indian fighters, Indian killers. The best of them didn't hesitate to kill an Indian. They thought of them, the savages, as the same as poisonous snakes. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. Now the Indians, they acted the same way, the warriors. That's why this area was the most dangerous place on earth. I've decided to spare you the graphic details, but if you want them, and I think it's important that we recognize that how people acted back then, they can act again. So I would consult the links I've listed in the post description. I particularly recommend the 1906 edition of the History of Westmoreland County. The guy who wrote it did an excellent job of combing through the legal documents of the era and really parsed out what happened here. The Westmoreland County Historical Society, which operates historic Hannistown, also avoids getting into all the violence of that period during its tours. They think there's so much else about frontier life they can talk about, and they do. I recommend you visit the site and tour the period houses. Also, this reconstructed fort, based in part on archaeological traces. Now, these Indian killers I've been talking about could be responsible, gentle souls at home, men who women rely on to keep them fed and safe, good fathers too. They were pioneers. That's a term that chokes up patriotic Americans. It evokes bravery, grittiness, a can-do attitude. These ordinary people, ordinary for their time and place, didn't like a government in London telling them that Indian land wasn't theirs to take. So they were all in on the American Revolution. They took their killing skills back east and joined the Continental Army. Before we check out Hannistown more closely, let's take a look at my maps. My go-to source, and everyone else's, for Pennsylvania Indian Paths is the book Indian Paths of Pennsylvania by Paul A.W. Wallace. It was first published in 1952 by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Subsequent editions have been printed as well. It's still in print. Wallace's book follows decades of research, walks, and drives on what remained of the trails. Aside from hiking traces left in woods and mountainsides, Wallace offers advice to motorists on how best to travel those paths by driving modern roads, the roads that were built on top or near the trails. That appealed to me. My hiking days, if I ever had any, were certainly past. But roads have changed over the past 60 or 70 years since his book was published. I went looking for an update. There is none. I also thought that in this day and age, GPS coordinates could be employed in any map project. That set me on the path, so to speak, of Let's Drive an Indian Path, the YouTube channel, and the GPS coordinated audio tours available at voicemap.me. The voicemap tours are intended to make everyday drives or turnpike journeys less tiresome. Here is Wallace's statewide view of the Indian Trail network. Pretty complicated, eh? Well, let's zoom in. We are currently making our way east on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Wallace shows that it was called the Raystown Path by fur traders. They used it to get to and from a trading post operated by John Ray in what is now Bedford, Pennsylvania. That was relatively recently. We're talking about colonial times, the early 1700s. The path is thousands of years older than that. What tribes called it before Europeans arrived likely depended on what they used it for. Coming from the east, many called it the Allegheny Path. That's because they were walking to tribes that lived along the Allegheny River. How did the river get its name? Now there's a good question. We'll save the messiness of tribal names, pronunciations, and the like for a future post. You won't believe much of it, but it'll make you smile and you'll shake your head. Wallace has labeled modern towns around the Raystown Path to give us reference points. Shonopinstown here was a Delaware village overseen by a chief named Shonopin. So that's what European immigrants called it, Shonopinstown. It was where the Lawrenceville neighborhood of Pittsburgh is today. Like most Indian villages, particularly those occupied by refugees of the settler invasion, it likely existed only about a year or two. Wallace placed Fort Duquesne here at the forks of the Ohio, again for reference. It was the French fort that was there only for 4 years before floods and a British army did away with it. Speaking of forts, those driving around Pennsylvania may often cross streams named like this one, 4 Mile Run. That's not the length of the run. Anyone want to guess what was 4 miles? And the answer is, what is the distance to the closest military fort? In this case, it was Fort Ligonier. The road and bridge engineers stationed at forts named the streams. Obviously, they were attuned to measurements, not poetry. Blacklegstown seems to have been a Shawnee village. Obviously, it's not a Shawnee name. Just who Blackleg was and why his leg was black is lost to time. Maybe we don't want to know. You can see the Raystown Path and the military road General Forbes had built atop it. It split here. The northern route avoided the Turtle Creek Valley and therefore was less susceptible to ambush. Hannastown is right here. Let's listen to what you would hear if you were using the GPS-triggered audio tour that I created for the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Directly north of us is Hannastown. It's a place your history teachers likely didn't mention when they were talking about the American Revolution. That's because when patriots wrote of the struggle against the mother country, much of their wartime propaganda was focused on the populated areas along the Atlantic coast. You know, the Boston Massacre, the battles of Lexington and Concord, Paul Revere, Saratoga. That's the history they wrote for our schoolhouses. This, out here, was the far west, insignificant woodlands. The redcoats weren't coming here. The redcoats weren't coming here. But the British government did have a powerful ally here, Indians. Much of the Iroquois Confederation of Tribes, including the Seneca, remained loyal to the Great Father in London. That was big trouble for unprotected settlers here. And there were plenty of white loyalists to join the Indians. Those who did thought it best to conceal their identities, so they dressed as Indians. There never was much to Hannistown. First a log tavern, then a log jail, and a 2-story courthouse. At its peak, it had maybe only 30 log houses. It sat along the Forbes Road, a wagon trail built atop Raystown Indian Path only 2 decades earlier. General John Forbes, a Scot, built the road as he marched 6,000 British soldiers across mountainous wilderness to drive out the French and erect Fort Pitt. That fort and road really opened the way for settlement. Both benefited colonists. But the projects ultimately caused them to rebel against England. They didn't want to pay for them. When the bill came due, Parliament tried taxing colonists. The cry went up, "Give me liberty or give me death." Well, death came. At little Hannistown, it came quite near the official end of the Revolution. It was a July Saturday in 1782. A settler harvesting wheat in a field spotted Indians. They were stripped nearly naked and painted for war. They were quietly moving through the woods. He and 2 other settlers picked up their rifles. Farmers never worked fields without weapons at hand, and quietly raced to Hannistown. It had a small fort, all settlements did, but panic ensued there. About 60 people quickly crammed into the stockade, not bothering to take any of their meager belongings. Sheriff Matthew Jack mounted a horse and galloped off to warn neighbors. 4 young men went out to spy on the warriors. They came running back with 100 Indians hot on their heels. They just managed to get into the stockade. Another settler wasn't quite as lucky. Carrying items gathered from his cabin, he was wounded slightly just as he made it inside. The Indians focused first on the abandoned cabins, looking for stragglers and plunder. They drove off horses, killed 100 cattle, as well as pigs and chickens. Then they opened fire on the stockade. It was made of pointed logs standing on end. Inside, settlers had 17 guns. They soon learned only 9 worked. The town's supply of good fighting men and weapons was greatly reduced the year before during a failed excursion into Ohio Indian Territory. Men took turns firing the 9 guns through the fort loopholes. That was enough to keep the warriors at bay. 2 Indians were killed, and the townspeople thought several others were at least wounded. Inside, everyone was okay, until a toddler got too close to a large hole in one of the gates. 16-year-old Margaret Shaw grabbed the youngster. As she moved in front of the hole, a bullet found her, plowed into her breast. She died 2 weeks later. Bullets continued boring into the stockade logs until it got dark. Then, flames lit up the settler cabins. They watched men dancing and whooping amid their burning homes. As the flames died, Indians, and the men dressed as Indians, went into the valley below and partied through the night. Few inside the fort slept. They waited for another attack after the sun rose, but it never came. When they ventured out, they found the ruins of a town that never came back. But they were still alive. Death, it turned out, had found other targets at a nearby wedding party. Friends and relatives gathered for a frolic. The Indians and the men dressed as Indians, they were called Canadian Rangers, swooped in. Several frolic guests were shot and killed as they went for their weapons. A dozen managed to flee and hide in the nearby fields and forests. 15 men and women and children, though, were taken prisoner. Among those was Joseph Brownlee and his wife and children. Brownlee had just been released from service as a lieutenant in the Continental Army. He was released because he'd been wounded. As the prisoners were forced through the woods, Mrs. Robert Hanna addressed Brownlee as captain. That was a bad idea. The Indians heard. They immediately killed him, and they killed the young boy he was carrying. Traditionally, Indians killed any captives who might slow them down, including children and elderly. They then killed 9 others with their tomahawks. That left only 4. Brownlee's wife and another son were spared, as was Mrs. Hanna and her daughter Jenny. After the burning of Hannistown, residents were encouraged to stay and rebuild. They didn't. Pennsylvania opted to build a new road. It bypassed what had been. The new road went through a place called Newtown. It became the seat of sprawling Westmoreland County. Newtown became Greensburg, and the new road became the Lincoln Highway, now Route 30. Well, thanks for coming along with me on this trip. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I hope you learned something that you didn't know before. If that's all true, and if you enjoyed it, then please consider subscribing to my channel. The way subscriptions work on YouTube is that once you go over 1,000, they start channeling advertising to you and sharing in those proceeds, and that would support my work. By the way, if you're thinking about stopping at the Hanna Tavern, like if you're traveling on the Turnpike for an overnight stay, I'd think twice about it. Those mattresses upstairs, they feel like they're stuffed with straw. What do you mean they are? Oh, yeah, I knew that. Anyway, Salinoka Kanola. That means, in Seneca, again we will see each other. I certainly hope so.